And so if I'm actually transferring energy from my back leg to my arms as I swing through, I should be contracting my glute, which is a hip extension move.
All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Scott Hassey, and this is episode 20 of ITTV. We've got Dr. Emily Ferree with us today, and I'm excited to talk a bunch about movement and all kinds of things and get to know a little bit more about what she does, her background, and then maybe even dive into some other side holes or rabbit holes. She was telling me before we started about some work that she does in the other sports, so that might be interesting as well. But before we get to that, I want to let everyone know, just a reminder, if you've not seen us before, you can follow us at Indiana Twins across the board on social media. So whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those things, just at Indiana Twins. And then on YouTube, you can just go to youtube.com/Indiana Twins. So this video, along with all the other ones that we do, all the other episodes, will be uploaded in the next couple days to YouTube. And under the show more, under the video, you'll be able to click down, it'll expand, and I'll have timestamps for all the topics that we talk about. So if you missed something, or you're curious, or you didn't want to watch the rest of it and you just kind of want to skip around, it's all there for you. So with that said, and if you want to email us, it is indianatwins@gmail.com. Pretty simple. It'll probably be me that responds to those emails. So with that said, we will get into this. And Emily, I first want to hear a little bit about how in the world you got into what you're doing now and then into the baseball realm of it.
Yeah, it's been kind of a wild ride, to be honest. There's not a lot of, I think, physical therapists in the type of role that I am in now. So I am a physical therapist by trade. I got my doctorate of physical therapy from USC. Right at the end of my training, I did some kind of specialized training in a clinic that did clinical biomechanics. So it was headed up by a man named Dr. Chris Powers, who is also a physical therapist by trade, but has swung to the research side of things and basically wanted to take some of the research grade data and analytics that we would do in a lab and make them clinically applicable. And his whole kind of career path has been really centered around the lower extremity. So he looked a lot at ACL injuries and the movements that are precursors to that, and tendonitis. And it was basically all these kind of 2D movements, but basically all centered on lumbar spine down. And I loved it. It was basically an avenue of physical therapy that offered actual solutions. I felt like it actually addressed the issue of why people were injured. And so instead of just healing the injury and then setting them back to do the exact same thing that they were doing in the first place to be injured, felt like we were actually solving a problem. And I think, love my profession, obviously, but there's definitely an end of it where the kind of physical therapy mantra is, okay, what hurts? Let me rub it. And that to me was like, not it. So fell in love with the biomechanics working there. And got hooked up with a colleague who was building a lab down in Orange County, and got in on the ground floor. And he actually had a 3D system. So I ended up traveling to Germany to work with a software company called CME to learn about how to operate a 3D biomechanics lab and just kind of like the logistics of 3D biomechanics, which kind of led me into rotational sports, obviously, which is where you need the 3D data. So tennis players, volleyball players, golfers, and then, of course, baseball pitchers was the big one. And I just wanted to learn as much as I could about it. So I just went into the community and got as many kids as I could to come to the lab and just get free 3D evaluations and just allow me to look at their movement and start looking at numbers and evaluate and kind of track them and see how they did. And that led me to Eugene Bleecker. Ended up evaluating one of his players. And so him and I started talking shop, and it was the perfect kind of collide of me on the biomechanics and physics and kind of medical side, melding with somebody fully just on the coaching and performance side who had some kind of knowledge of movement and things like that, and looking at the questions that he was asking about performance and coaching and his players and what he was seeing from just more so the performance side and what I was looking at data-wise, and kind of just being able to get a melding of minds going. And from there on, we just started testing as much as we possibly could. And some of the data that we put out started putting me in contact with some major league organizations and testing some higher level players from them, and got me eventually in contact with Lance Wheeler and testing some stuff for him. And so really it's just kind of been this journey of coming into contact with people who are asking really intriguing questions. And we're looking at things from a different lens than I was, and just being able to have the equipment and the resources to look at that and research that, and just ask questions and find stuff out, I guess. And here we are.
Yeah. What led you into physical therapy because, reading a little bit about your bio and everything about you, obviously you're incredibly brilliant. You were top of your class in your master's program. Just listening to you speak in different forums and different presentations, you can just tell we're talking with someone who's bright. But what was it a challenge? Was it an inspiration? What led you into physical therapy?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I'm 100% the total cliche physical therapist. I mean, we're all just old ex-athletes that got injured, had the dream come crashing down. And I mean, athletes, like we all, our identity, our hopes, our dreams, our worth, our value is so tied up in sports. And it's such part of who we are that when you lose that, there's this kind of huge transformational experience, either for the better or for the worse. And I think those of us who go out on an injury come into contact and relationship with a PT or a trainer or some sort of medical personnel that can be really formative. And for me, it was super formative and super redeeming of that time of my life. And so I think I already had an emotional attachment with that as it was. But to be honest, I actually wanted to be a journalism major when I got into college. And I think I just have always had a science mind, and I would never badmouth my old alma mater, USC, but I felt like I was getting dumber in my journalism major. I just didn't feel like I was being challenged. And so I swung to the opposite end of the pendulum and was like, what's the hardest thing that I could possibly think of to do? And that was be pre-med and go to med school. Not because I wanted to be a doctor or anything like that, but I was literally just like, what's the hardest thing that I can do? And so I went the pre-med track and just did a 180. And I had a friend of mine who was also an athlete at USC. And she was like, hey, like you were an athlete, like you've had this experience, you've been injured, you've been through the process, like you should go PT. It would suit you so much better. And like I said, I kind of already had a soft spot for physical therapy and ended up volunteering in a clinic and was just like, yeah, this is it.
Well, that's awesome. I can relate in the former athlete, and then you're just kind of like, what in the world do you do? What are you good at? And I admire the challenge that you've taken on. It's definitely paid off. So let's go back into present day with what you're doing kind of on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. And I know in any field of medicine of any kind, things vary obviously from day to day. So generally speaking, what's going on week to week, whether that's right now or just throughout the year, what are you doing? Because you're throwing out a lot of these buzzwords of, I'm working in the lab and I'm doing the physical therapy thing and all these programs. There's a lot going on. So what's the day-to-day look like?
Yeah, there's a ton going on. I am lucky that I get such a variety of the things that I do. So some of the stuff I do is traditional physical therapy. We get people who are post-op or have, injuries in game that need, rehab and need, kind of traditionally what we think of as physical therapy. And I am doing that kind of thing as well. We have athletes who come in who I see on the regular year round, whether or not they're injured. And we do a lot of wellness, conditioning, training, things like that, just keeping them feeling good throughout the year, even if they're not injured, which I think is the golden spot for athletes. If you're only seeing a medical personnel or a trainer or a PT in times of crisis, I think it's already too late. So we do some of that wellness stuff as well. And we actually do some training with some athletes as well. And then in my clinic, we have a clinical biomechanics lab. So I am also operating the biomechanics lab. So we're doing movement analysis of all sports, all movements. So we do 2D analysis with like running, cutting, jumping, and then we do 3D analysis with basically any athlete who's rotational, who needs that kind of higher level data. And then I'm analyzing that data and using that evaluation to develop plan of care, to evaluate whether an athlete's at risk for injury or why they got injured in the first place. So we do have injured athletes that come in for a movement evaluation to figure out why and what to do moving forward. And then we have athletes who aren't injured who come in for a movement evaluation to figure out, are they safe, or performance-wise, is there something they can do to be, more efficient, more powerful, increase performance in some way? So basically all those things, and across all sports, probably my two major sports being baseball and football. We work a lot with the NFL as well.
How long did it take you to, and obviously you had your schooling, and then I would assume that the learning process was expedited when you were having an influx of free clients to be able to evaluate movement. How long did that take you to get comfortable using the lab that you had learned from the company in Germany, then doing kind of your own testing, things like that? How long did that take where you were comfortable to say, I kind of understand what's going on, how to evaluate, the data looks good, and I can come up with a good process for it?
Yeah. I mean, it's an ongoing process. We kind of joked earlier before this officially started rolling. You know how long you've been in baseball? I was like, yeah, 3.5 years. So I know everything now. It's continuous. I'm definitely still learning. And my hope is in 5 years that I'm like, man, I had no idea. It's also this, this, and this. And so I would by no means tell you that I know everything now. But I mean, the didactic education, to get your doctorate in physical therapy is long. So it's 4 years of undergrad and then 3 years to get your doctorate degree. And that includes a lot of education in biomechanics, physics, human physiology, biology, kind of all those things that come together to create an understanding of movement and movement science. And then, I mean, probably to actually learn the logistics of like, how do you actually operate, physically operate a biomechanics lab, probably took, man, not much longer than like 2-3 months, but actually becoming like, really comfortable with, if a pitcher walked in, I could tell you what's wrong and why. I mean, that took, man, I'm going to say probably a year for me to like really confidently say like, this is what's wrong. And the last couple of years, I think I've kind of really developed a specialty to understand why. All right, here's what's going on with your movement, but here's why that's going on, which has really kind of opened up a whole new spectrum of analysis, in my opinion. That's, I think, a lot more meaningful for athletes. I think a lot of people are saying like, hey, this, and this, value is off, or, your stance here is not right, but nobody can actually tell the athlete why. And that's ultimately where like our drill prescription comes from. That's ultimately where like a lot of our programming comes from too. So that's been a process as well. And that's something I'm, obviously still growing in. So.
Do you think you benefited coming from outside of the baseball world to be able to bring a bunch of different perspectives and experiences?
I do. I think I've become such a proponent of being able to bring minds together from different disciplines and different backgrounds. I think, especially in the baseball world, you'll have people from different disciplines like, strength and conditioning, medical, player development guys coming together, but they're all from baseball backgrounds, and they've all heard the same messages, from when they were players to when they were professionals to now when they're coaching. And so there is like a very much a baseball lens of how we look at things. And gosh, it's been around for so long. There's these kind of age-old mantras that we all believe to be truth. And I think not coming from the baseball world, there's so many things that like I think people have believed to be true for so long that I'm like, but I would never even think that that was good, or that like I would never think to coach somebody into that. I would never think to say that. And so I think coming into it maybe more critically for that reason of like, I don't know why you guys believe that's good. I mean, the biggest example that comes to my mind, and Eugene and I laugh about this all the time, like he'll come to me with an idea of like, hey, I want to test this because, for this, and this reason. I'm like, wait, coaches say that? Like people think that's a good thing? Like why? Like that doesn't make sense, just looking at that from a muscle physiology standpoint or from, a physics standpoint, like I can't see why that would be a good thing. And I think the biggest example of that was when we started looking at recoil. And Eugene's like, the whole baseball world thinks this is like means weak decelerators. And it like blew my mind. But I think everybody who's in a baseball world, who's even also in the medical field, like when you've already kind of been preconditioned to believe that, you just kind of go with it and you look at things less critically. Whereas because I don't come from a baseball background, and that's never been a message that's told to me, I could just kind of critically say like, that's not true. And that led to, some really cool research that we did. But I know it hinders me as well because because I'm not from the baseball world, and there's things that I don't know, and I can't rattle off all these players' names who like do this well and do this well, and there are kind of, like I kind of harped on age-old mantras that aren't true. There's some age-old mantras that are true too. So it's beneficial and hindering sometimes, but I think if you have people that come from the baseball world and come from outside the baseball world, being able to work together, I think that's a really sweet spot.
So I do want to get.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, hey, I told you it's live. I do want to get back to the arm recoil later. So, but what I wanted to kind of move on to next, and I had asked you about this over text, kind of what some things were that you were passionate, you want to talk about, what you thought were kind of some important topics. So I loosely paraphrased you. And the way I kind of laid this out was we're going to talk about what the problem is within baseball in your, through your lens of what you're seeing from kind of a data standpoint. And then we're going to look at some of the solutions. So from a problem standpoint, you had basically paraphrasing had said, players are taught, coached, or instructed based on averages from years of data and research. So elaborate on what you meant by that, because that's a lot to unpack. But
Yeah. Um, the fascinating and beautiful thing about baseball, but also I think what makes baseball difficult is there are so many quantifiables and so many measurables and so many data points. If we just look at pitching alone, the amount of pitchers that each organization has between their big league team and their minor league system, then multiply that by the amount of teams that we have in this country, multiply that by the amount of games that we play in a season. I say we as if I play as well, that they play in a season, is insane, the amount of data points that we can collect per person, and then again multiply that across the amount of people that we have pitching. And so I think sometimes when you have this mass amount of data, it allows you to track some pretty powerful correlations and find averages. But the problem with averages is we miss the outliers. And the whole point of finding an average is that you exclude the outliers and find what are most people doing. And I think there's a ton to be learned from the outliers. Why is somebody a freak? What are they doing? Why does this work for this body type but not this body type? So I think we miss some of and research isn't designed to do this, by the way. Nobody's going to publish a case study on somebody because it's not considered high level evidence, but thousands of data points is considered higher level evidence. But I think the way that that's designed misses the minor details of some things that people are doing that are making them absolute freaks that we could actually learn from. The other problem is, by nature, like, we're making people average instead of trying to look at what the outliers are doing, and they're outliers for a reason. And so when you find averages and then try and apply that exact number to every single person, we've missed the whole point that came from this mass amount of data points that not everybody fit in that exact category, but we found the average. So if everybody's here and the middle of that is here, there could be nobody here, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But now we've told everybody they have to be here because this was average. When that number may actually not work for A, every person that walks through the room, or B, anybody, if that makes sense. So averages are tough. There's a reason that research looks at averages, but if we could look critically at the research and say, sure, research says this, but how can I better apply that to an individual and not just blindly apply that to an individual?
Yep. Do you think that it is a fundamental issue within not only baseball, but I would almost say just the general population of people, that there's a very poor understanding of research, in that what is a correlation you even said evidence doesn't always mean answer. Correlation doesn't always mean causation. That's where it came from. You think that part of the issue is just people don't understand what research really is?
Totally. And here's the thing, not everybody should have to understand what research is. There's a reason that we have scientists. Not every single person is a scientist, but I think the way that research gets presented does people a disservice. Like, we present things as absolutes, and a lot of times they'll just put a headline on a research study, and when you actually read the research study, it's not saying what they say it's saying. Or, somebody on Twitter will tweet about a research study and use a research study to prove a point, and if you actually read the research study, it's not necessarily proving the point that they're saying. Or we'll take evidence from a research study, and this is what every research paper does, is they, perform an experiment, gather results, come up with a conclusion, and part of that conclusion is inferred. Hey, we found this number, so we think this. That's an opinion. And so they're making an opinion based on the data that they analyze, but what most people only read is the opinion part, if that makes sense. So if people had the ability to more critically look at data and more critically look at what they studied, I think it would give us a better idea of, how to apply that to our players and how to apply that to our population, versus just reading headlines or just reading conclusions. But I think it also falls on the scientists and the researchers who are presenting this to present it in a more fair and accurate way. So, and here's the thing too, that I think does people a huge disservice, is we love to use, and I say we because I would consider myself in the science and research community, but we love to use super sciencey words and bank on the fact that people don't know what those words mean. And if we sound smart, then people will believe us. Again, I'm new to Twitter and this world is fascinating to me, but someone tweeted out a drill, and their reasoning for why that drill worked was because it created neural mapping. And that's a prime example of neural mapping means nothing. They said the brain focuses on neural mapping. That's like saying the brain is a brain. The brain is a neural map. Like, the brain doesn't focus on neural mapping. Your brain is neural connections. Like, it doesn't focus on neural connections. It is neural connections, but you just said something that sounded like neuroscience and sounded like neurophysiology. And unless you had a background in neuroscience and neurophysiology, you wouldn't be able to tell this person, you have no idea what you're talking about, or you just said words that mean nothing. But instead they're like, oh shoot, like this drill focuses on neural mapping. Like, I got to do this drill. Like, newsflash, if I touch my nose 10 times fast, I just created a neural map. That literally means like I moved, my brain created neurologic signals that perform that movement. It's wild to me. And I just think it does coaches who are actually in the trenches with players a huge disservice, because they aren't scientists and they shouldn't be scientists, but they're being taken for granted that they don't know some of these sciencey words, and that's being used against them to convince them of what they should be doing.
Welcome to Twitter.
Yeah.
I mean,
I wanted to go on a diatribe about it, but I didn't.
Best of luck. I'll be curious where you are in 10 years, because some people have those same feelings and then never go away. Some people get over it, some people don't, some people don't want to go over it. But all right, now we are going to be problem solvers. So we've addressed the problem, we've set everything up. Now we're going to solve all the problems out there. We're going to fix everything.
Oh, gosh.
So,
big task.
So my first question is, where do the coaches fit in the education spectrum of all this data? Because you would love it if we had coaches, and you told me this, if we had coaches that understood what the data really meant, and then understood movement, understood those things and how we can change those. Where's the coaches, where do they fit in this area? Where should we be focusing on?
Yeah. So I think there's two different answers to this question. I think it depends on what level you're coaching. If I start with the big league organizations, they have the resources to have high level data, to be able to analyze basically everything. And a lot of teams are moving in the direction of having a biomechanist and trying to actually use some of this data to make it relevant to players, and not just, analyzing trends over the last 10 years. And so on that regard, like, organizations really have, in my opinion, no excuse not to integrate all departments, medical, player development, data analysts, strength and conditioning, and all be able to speak the same language and actually know, if I'm a coach in a big league organization, I should be able to send my pitcher to the biomechanics lab, get an evaluation, and be able to talk shop with the biomechanist and know what's going on. And so part of that comes from the biomechanist being able to teach the organization, potentially consultants coming in to be able, basically provide educational content to get everybody on the same page. But big league organizations have those resources, right? One, to educate their staff, and two, to have all those resources. And the problem comes with, high school, college level coaches, travel ball coaches who don't have the resources to do mocap and things like this and actually get a full biomechanics eval. So while I say data is important, here's the thing. I understand not everybody can have data. And so me telling, like, a high school baseball coach who's trying to do right by his kids, like, you need to understand all these data points, that's probably not true. And what I would say about the data is that the data is not the end all be all. The data should confirm what we see with our eyes. When you watch a player, if you have a really good idea of movement and movement efficiency and what a delivery should look like, and what healthy movement looks like, the numbers are just telling you, one, if your eyes are right, and two, potentially why your eyes are right. So if coaches don't have, access to resources and technology that would allow them to actually look at data and have data on their players, my recommendation would be, you should be able to qualitatively look at your players, and be able to assess movement quality, which, by the way, a lot of these people that know the data so well can't actually evaluate movement quality. They only can look at the numbers and say, this number's good, this number's bad, which I don't think does a player any service either. So I think there needs to be a marriage of qualitative movement analysis with the quantitative. And if you don't have access to the quantitative, that's okay. Work with what you got. I mean, if you have a cell phone and you can take a video of your pitcher, be able to kind of put that guy in slow-mo and look at his movement quality and decide, hey, this looks off, this looks inefficient. Like, what can we problem solve here? So being able to start looking at things from different angles and being able to understand qualitative movement, I think, is so important for coaches.
So if we're talking about understanding movement, where would a coach start? Because I mean, the big wave right now is get your certification from this organization or this person or this program, learn how the body works over here, learn mechanics over here, learn assessment here, learn drill work. I mean, where would you put, because I'm getting people asking me saying, hey, I see you've got this certification, which is all good and great, but like, where should I start? I might not have money. And like you said, with a high school coach, a travel coach, a Division III college assistant coach who means the best by his players and really wants to help them, but all they do have is a phone. So how can they best, because a lot of times you're going to have, let's say, a former catcher who was a really good hitter, needs to take over the pitching staff and he wants to help them, but doesn't really understand movement as well. Where can that guy start?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard not to just instantly plug, like Eugene and I have come up with courses to teach coaches about like the basics of biomechanics and the basics of how you analyze pitching, which we have, and they're on 108's website. So of course I'm biased, and I think those courses are great and super educational and super accessible to a coach that A, doesn't have technology, and B, wants to be able to visually look at their player. So quick plug for that. Had to. You didn't even know you were setting me up for that, but you did. But honestly, I think the best place to go is, I mean, baseball is such a interwoven community. What I've realized over the last couple of years is bring your video to somebody who's been in it for longer, and bring your video to somebody who is assessing movement. I mean, I get sent videos of kids all the time, or there's, places that have, performance academies in your area probably that have guys that are looking at movement, maybe not, with the full resources of a mocap lab, but start just getting with people who have been coaching longer than you or have access to some sort of equipment and say, what do you see in this pitch and delivery? What are you looking for? Because I think the greatest way to learn movement is to ask somebody else, what do you generally look for? And why do you look for that? Or else, how do you even know? There's no good grid of where to start otherwise. Yeah.
So I love that answer. And then I want to add to it. So let's say they start asking those questions and their interest is piqued, which is probably me 10 years ago. And you're like, oh yeah, this pitcher after release, he pronates, and then the coach just kind of puts this word in the back of his head and then goes home and Googles it. So now that you've piqued their interest and they're really wanting to know how the body starts to work, so where would you gear them to, like, what would they need to Google? What type of book? What type of thing would they look at to kind of start to understand a little bit more about the body?
I'm a huge fan of Antonio Stecco's work. He does a lot with, the whole Stecco family has done a lot with the fascial system and kind of the way that the body's organized. If you look up anatomy trains, there's a book, but they have some open resource research that people can look up as well, just basically about how the muscular system and fascial system is organized and how we create tension across the body and what kind of reciprocal movement is, and why certain muscles work together and why certain muscles don't work together, and because of that, why certain movements are natural to the human body and why certain movements are not natural to the human body. So I think that's a great foundational understanding to then be able to look at movement and say, this is good because, this is bad because. If that makes sense.
What was the name of the family again?
Stecco, Stecco. Antonio Stecco's the main guy.
Okay.
Anatomy Trains is the name of of one of the books that came out about the fascial system and kind of the way it's organized, and slings and chains and things like that. That I think is a great resource for anybody.
And I do want to dive in a little bit about fascia again a little bit later, but okay. So we've got the coach who doesn't have very many resources, but he's got a phone. He can ask elder coaches, we'll say, or coaches with more experience, which is fantastic. Now they're kind of diving a little bit about the anatomy. So they're getting a good grasp of this. They're starting to kind of connect the dots from the last 10, 15 years of playing and coaching. And, oh, that's why this was happening, those things. So now they want to start looking at the data. Again, they see there's certifications out there. There's these vests that you can do. There's other kinds of data points that you can get with, maybe not with all that technology. Where can someone start, or a coach start, just to kind of understand data and then even implement it too?
So I think the quick answer to understanding data is, again, looking at research and looking at, I hate this word, but normative values. And not to say that you should look at these normative values and say, all right, this is the numbers that my player should fall into, but it gives you an idea of the language and the kinematics. So if you look at kinematic research, so there's research out there that has literally just studied what is happening in a baseball pitch, and what are the average of the numbers that we see. So again, you know, I'm not a fan of averages, but it's research that's been done to actually explain what's happening. And I think that gives coaches or somebody without a physics background a really good idea of what is velocity, what is acceleration, when is the pelvis rotating, why, you know, just basically logistically what's happening. It doesn't tell you the whys of why it's happening, but it tells you, like, you know, as the arm is coming, you know, when the arm is in this position, when the pitcher's in this phase of the delivery, there's a force on the shoulder, you know, that there's a distraction force happening, or there's a compression force happening, or there's torque in the external rotation direction. So it basically just gives you the actual forces and the kinetics of what's happening in the pitch, and the kinematics. So kinetics is the forces that create movement. Kinematics describes the movement. So kinematics would be like acceleration, velocity, things like that. Kinetics would be force, torque, things like that.
Well, that makes sense to give them kind of a framework. So
Yeah.
let's say, I want to give you a good example so it's not all general. Let's say a coach is at an organization, let's say they got their first job at the collegiate level and the organization has a rap soda. So the team uses rap soda and they want to kind of dig into just using that unit, or it doesn't have to be rap soda. Maybe you can come up with something a little bit different. You know, let's do this since we're talking more movement. Let's say, because I know there's University in Indianapolis locally here. I don't know to what extent, but I know they use some type of lab. They've got force plates and some other things. And if the new coach joins that team, what questions should they be asking? What things should they be doing if they maybe have never been exposed to those things, to really get comfortable with it and start to understand it?
Yeah. I mean, the collegiate level is, I think, such the perfect place to learn that, because when you have PhD students who need lab rats, and two, a lot of them need projects, things like this, and then the lab is obviously accessible for free to the coach and the players, and they can get with those the director of the lab and actually get things tested. I would honestly simply start with, can we do a pitching evaluation? And you know, let's say they did the step before this. They Googled kinematic research on pitching data, and you pick one variable. I want to look at sequencing. I want to look at pelvis rotational velocity compared to torso rotational velocity compared to arm rotational velocity, and just literally looking at what does that data actually look like, what numbers are coming up, when are those, what does it look like to pair a number with movement. So I'm watching that number change as I'm watching qualitatively what happens with the movement, and I would really pick one variable at a time. And then I would Google research about like what's current in baseball research. So are people talking about lead leg blocking right now? Are people talking about, you know, weight distribution in the back leg during knee lift? What's a variable that's in the research? Okay, I'm going back to the lab and I'm looking at what does that look like with my player? When is that happening? So I think there's a lot of value in looking at how that's measured in a lab, and then being able to pair that qualitatively. What does that look like in the movement? So that if I don't have access to data, I can now visually watch my player and tell if it looks like what it's supposed to look like, or have an idea of what the data would say because I'm watching it with my eyes. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I feel like you have kind of wet our whistle with enough little teasers along the way that I want to start to dive into some of those things now. So I think we've given coaches a big framework to learn a little bit more about data movement. So I thought of this question, I think a couple of days ago, but I forgot to write it down. So I'm going to go right into this question first. What is something either recently or in the last couple of years that you have found to be kind of a little passion project or finding, or something that maybe wasn't either known or accepted, or just kind of came out of nowhere within you dissecting pictures? You know, you're in it the last 3-4 years and you're like, oh, hey, I found this thing and apparently no one's talking about it. I can't believe it. What's something like that?
I think one of the biggest I guess, surprises to me coming from a PT background, but I think it was also talked a lot about in the baseball world was pitchers who lack internal rotation on their back leg. And we learn about in physical therapy school, you see someone not move well, throw them on the table, test their range of motion. And if they don't have the right range, oh my gosh, of course they're not moving well. You got to fix their range, stretch their hip, give them mobility exercises. And so that was something that I was kind of pre-programmed with. And then the more I actually watched pitch deliveries, I was like, these pitchers are never moving into an extreme range of motion of internal rotation. They are internally rotating, but they're doing it from an pre-positioned external rotation because, if this is the femur, oh man, I'm a hot commodity tonight. Sorry, FaceTime. So basically the pelvis rotates forward, which puts the hip in a position of relative external rotation. And then obviously the back leg drives forward and rotates, and it's rotating inwardly in the direction of inward rotation, but pitchers aren't getting into this position of an extreme absolute internal rotation range of motion. So I started asking the question, like, why is everybody promoting this so heavily? And why, as, quote unquote movement specialists, are we not just looking at this movement and saying, hey, that's not relevant? And so instead we're cranking on these guys passively and trying to stretch the heck out of their hip and then expecting them to move differently when it's just irrelevant. And I think the other thing I would say too is an assessment where you throw a pitcher on a table and move their limb will never, ever, ever be relevant to how they move. Because even the classic one, if I put a pitcher on a table and externally rotate their shoulder to see if they've got enough layback, is not going to be the same range of motion that I see in their delivery. One is passive, one is active, one, their core is completely off. One, it's the amount of force and with the movement that they're producing going down a mound, like it's just, in my opinion, not applicable whatsoever. And even the physical therapy research has gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And they've produced all these studies that basically said, hey, remember all this stuff we said about like range of motion, shoulder range of motion, and how it's a predictor for injury? Actually, there really is no strong correlation. And yet, like, our best assessment for a lot of these pitchers is we throw them on a table and we measure their range of motion. And we say good, bad, or ugly. And so I think it's been a little bit of a passion project of mine to like get people to stop taking pitchers out of their movement to assess them. Your number one assessment should be their actual delivery going down a mound.
So I want to not necessarily push back, but I want to follow up with, because you said that it's not applicable. So when you were talking about that, first thing came to mind was, because me not being a physical therapist, me not having a biomechanics background, one of the things I first started doing was just any assessment I could find online and talking to people smarter than me, things that were easier or quick that could shed light, maybe not give me an answer. And at the time, 5 years ago or more, even probably 3 years ago, if I looked at like hamstring flexibility, for example, it's a good example of something that to me made sense with how it could have implications with the delivery, how we could maybe look at it real quick. And if there was a big red flag, I would kind of see it. And for me, I guess it was more absolute before. And to your point, there's probably no absolute with on the table assessment. But is there ever a time where, let's say that an active straight leg raise, and then you retest it by, doing it without the player doing you're lifting. If there's just some extreme lack of hamstring flexibility, which I know is also a loaded diagnosis if you're going to diagnose it, could that then give you some semblance of an idea of what's happening within their delivery? And it may change. Like, I don't think you're ever going to see limited hamstring flexibility and then perfect hamstring flexibility as they go through, they rotate and they follow through. But could it give some type of a highlight or a shadowing of what's going on?
For sure. It's not that there's no information that can be gained from them, but I think the way they've traditionally been used is in isolation. I test your hamstrings. Oh, your hamstrings are tight. We just need to stretch your hamstrings, instead of looking at, we joke about it all the time, but the name of our lab is called Movement First. And the reason for that is we evaluate movement first and attempt to change movement first. So if I see a problem with the delivery, the first thing I'm going to try to change is the environment, the setup, something about a precursor to movement to see if they can move differently. And if I can't set up their mechanics to move differently, then I'm going to go look at, okay, do you have a motor control issue? Do you have a strength issue? Do you have a range issue? And so it's not that they don't have value. It's, I think that they don't have value by themselves, if that makes sense.
Fair enough. And I think that's important to clarify and elaborate, because as a cool quote, it could be misunderstood that talking about movement first, because some people interpret range of motion tests as movement, whereas you're talking about how do they throw, basically. What does it look like when they throw?
Exactly. Yep.
Good clarification. So I did want to, because I was listening and I tweeted this out to one of your talks, and you were talking about, and I don't know if you did it on purpose or if that was one of your big ahas with the internal rotation. So I'm going to actually share my screen. Okay. And let's go with this one. Can you see this?
Yes.
Perfect. This is Justin Verlander. Now I want you with the visual to explain, because this took me a minute. I was thinking in my head. I was listening to you on the podcast at 1.2 speed. So I had to pause you, think about some stuff you were saying. It was a big light bulb moment for me. But can you, and you can tell me where to kind of move this through, kind of re-explain the hip internal rotation and what people thought was going on and what's actually going on?
Yes. So, so basically, if you look at, again, this is a little bit of a cheater way to do it, but if you look at what makes up the hip joint is femur, long bone, ball and socket, pelvis. So here's your hip joint. So the pelvis is obviously basically operates as a unit, so it rotates together. So as he goes to stride down this mound right now, when we talk about hip opening, we talk about basically that pelvis rotating towards home plate. So if you imagine his belt buckle starting to face form right there, good. Back him up just a little bit. Okay, even more. Before he starts to internally rotate his femur. Okay, right here. Right where you just were. That's perfect. Okay, so right here, his pelvis is starting to turn towards home plate, but you see he's holding on to external rotation in that back leg. So his knee hasn't begun to collapse yet, correct?
Yep.
So what that happens is his femur hasn't moved, but his pelvis has rotated forward. So there's two different types of range of motion. There's relative and absolute. So when we talk about hip range of motion, we're generally talking about femur moving on pelvis, but we also have pelvis moving on a fixed femur. And so they both create anatomically the same movement. So if I want to, let's say home plate is that way for me. So, and I'm starting like this. So if I want to externally rotate, I can either move my femur away from home plate, or I can move my pelvis towards home plate. Both of those are external rotation. But with my femur fixed and my pelvis just moving, now I'm in a position of relative external rotation. My femur didn't actually move. So what happens is we get this initial pelvis moving. Now I'm in relative external rotation. Now my femur is going to drive towards internal rotation, but my pelvis is already going forward. So absolute internal rotation would just be this. We never actually get to this full range of motion because my pelvis is already open. So by the time I'm turning this way, I'm rotating from a position of relative external rotation towards internal rotation. Think about if you had a number scale and 0 was right in the middle and that's neutral, and negative was external rotation and positive was internal rotation. We start from like a -3 and move to a 2, if that makes sense. So people see, so that full range of motion was 5 degrees, right? So people think you need 5 degrees of internal rotation, but you don't need 5 degrees of internal rotation. You need 2 because you started from -3 external, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So that femur, directionally, we are internally rotating, but doing it from a position of basically being pre-positioned into relative external rotation.
Yeah, because the way, and for those of you that still aren't getting it, because I'm sure there's some that aren't, I'm actually going to stand up and correct me if anything I say is wrong. Because what I used to interpret was that, I'll get it down a little bit. As you go down the mound, this leg is going to go and turn inward like this. My knee is going to turn inward. Meanwhile, my belt buckle's still here, so this knee is turned in. That's the way I used to interpret it. And then when you were talking about it, I realized that here this is neutral, my hip's neutral. As this does turn in, my hip is also turning in almost at the same time.
Precisely. Yes, exactly.
Because I used to hear the same thing, like, oh, you got to measure hip internal rotation and look at the hips and all those other things because that's what's going on. And it all made sense because everything is moving in, but I didn't realize they were moving in together. And it was just like kind of this big aha moment. I was like, huh.
Yeah. We forget that there's two parts of the hip.
Right.
If they both do this, the relative position hasn't changed, right? But internal rotation is traditionally one fixed, one moved. So.
Yeah, and then we'll watch. So yeah, as the knee's turning in, so is that hip. So they're staying relatively neutral.
Yeah, this is going to be morbid, but if you sliced his pelvis in half and froze that moment in time and just looked at where his femur and his acetabulum was, which is the socket of your hip joint, he'd be almost neutral, guaranteed.
Yep. And then the next thing I was going to look at is even here, you're talking about internal rotation of the front leg. I mean, his hip still is relatively neutral here, whereas some people used to think that, and I guess maybe for a hypermobile guy, they continue to rotate around their front femur, but
yeah,
most they're staying neutral again. Would you?
I think there's a little bit more validity to the internal rotation on that lead leg because it stays fixed in the ground. And there is a little bit of that pelvis. Like if you watch from the back, basically some pictures to butt cheeks, there is a little bit of rotating out over that leg. So I would say internal rotation on that front leg is more important.
Gotcha.
And then go back to near stride foot contact. Back when he's got two legs on the ground. Yeah. Okay, so this is like the prime example of someone traditionally we would say someone just drove into internal rotation, which we just discussed how that's actually not true. But look at the position of his hip. He's in a good amount. Like that's almost, if I had to guess, like at least 40 degrees of hip abduction, which is basically femur coming out away from midline of the body. And my question to people who are measuring internal rotation, traditionally the way we do it is we throw a picture on a table, we bring their hip up into 90 degrees, neutral outer abduction, and then we rotate internal external. That is not even the position that the hip is internally and externally rotated. Like if you actually want to know if a pitcher has enough rotation, you better be cranking his leg into abduction and then asking him to rotate. And here's the thing too, as soon as you're weight bearing, those ranges can and should change. So really, if you want to know if a pitcher has enough rotation, you better be having him stand spread eagle and then having him rotate as far as he can, both ways. So again, it's not that these static assessments have no value, but I would love if the physical therapists, coaches, and trainers alike were assessing these things like range of motion in a way that was more helpful, the more applicable, more relevant.
That's perfect. I'm glad we're able to do that. I don't know if it showed up as much on the Instagram TV, but they can check it out on the YouTube. It'll show up. Okay, let me pull back up questions. Okay. Next, let's just go right into fascia. So that I don't even know where to start with that. I mean, but I think it's been a huge unlock as you and Eugene have kind of gotten the word out in the last couple of years and spoken at some conferences. It's starting to pick up a little bit of steam within those people that attend the conferences. I don't think it's by any means mainstream at all across the board with anyone. So for those that are just kind of being introduced to this word that they maybe never heard of, fascia, and how it can affect sports or athletes, and whether you want to get into reciprocal motion too, I guess as much as you kind of want to take a couple minutes to talk about fascia.
Yeah. Again, I just want to plug being able to talk shop with people that aren't from the same background or same discipline as you, because the whole reason that this kind of blew up for Eugene and I is he wanted to look at hitters who kicked back. And he didn't understand why, but he was getting way better results. And he saw this little mini Jose Altuve who was doing it. How is this little mini guy just hitting absolute bombs? Well, he does this weird thing. I wonder if I make my kids do this weird thing if they have results. And so we were getting these crazy results. He didn't know why. And to me, again, not coming from a baseball world, I'm like, well, he's creating cross tension. Like our body, that's actually putting him in a position of reciprocal movement. And Eugene is like, what's reciprocal movement? And then we talked about it and talked about the gait cycle and how basically all these motor patterns were designed to be used in the human body. And he was like, you just literally gave me the answer to the things that I already know are good and better and that I've already been training, but now I have a reason why. And now I'm like, well, I've known the science behind why the human body works, but now you're telling me about baseball movement and why you're seeing results. And so we just got to marry these two things together, which ended up being so fascinating and interesting. But fascia. So what it is, if you sliced a human being down the middle and just skinned them, what's right underneath our skin is a layer of connective tissue called fascia. So it is completely continuous head to toe across your entire body. Like you literally have a full casing of it on your whole body, but it's also continuous, not just on the outside, but internally as well. So our organs are cased in fascia, our nerves are cased in fascia. We have a connective tissue lining over bones that is connected to fascia. It's literally this completely continuous, it's the only completely continuous tissue or organ or substance in the entire human body. So what it is, it's basically a network. It's made out of collagen tissues, which is, basically our body's building blocks of first off tissue. And the way it works is it overlies the whole human body, and all of our muscles attach at least to some degree into the fascial system. So the general knowledge of how muscles worked for a really long time was that a muscle attaches and becomes a tendon, and that tendon's attached to a bone. So when a muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, which then pulls on the bone, and that creates movement. Now that's not wrong, but it's just not the whole story. So up to 30% of our muscle fibers insert into the fascia above that muscle as well. So when a muscle contracts, it also pulls on that connective tissue, which does a whole host of things. The first of which is it just creates tension. Like if you imagine cinching a bag around somebody, you basically created this corset-like tension in the body, which more on that in a second. But what that also does is, so if every muscle in your body is attached to fascia and one muscle contracts and pulls on your fascial system, that means the fibers that are attached to another muscle down the line are getting pulled and stretched. And we have this neurologic reflex in our body that responds to tension and stress, or tension and stretch. So the muscle spindle responds to stretch. So when those muscle fibers are stretched, because another muscle has pulled on the fascia above that muscle, it creates this nervous system response reflex within your spinal cord that actually activates that muscle group as well and primes that muscle for activation. So we get this automatic kind of pre-priming of certain muscles to work together. So you get that maximum stretch. Again, you would think, oh, it's continuous to the whole body, so shouldn't all muscles get primed if you contract one? Well, the way that our fascia is organized is we have these fibers, and the fibers go in different directions in different parts of the body, which is where you get these fascia, we call them slings and chains. So when a muscle contracts, it's stretching along the fibers. So if my fibers go this direction, it's going to pull on the muscles that are all also running along this line. It's not going to pull on a muscle up here that is kind of facing a different direction, if that makes sense to kind of simplify it. So it's basically your body is pre-programmed and pre-organized and designed to contract certain muscles in unison and certain muscles together and create tension and length across certain muscles and certain muscles together. So you have these slings and chains where muscles are generally being activated together, and then you have kind of correlating slings and chains in the opposite direction where those are now being stretched together. So if you think about a gait cycle, we kind of swing arms naturally, opposite arm, opposite leg. And if you've ever thought about, like, with walking, like, why don't we just walk with our hands at our sides? Why do our arms swing? Well, it's partially a product of we're basically rotating around a spine, around the center. And that rotation is creating reciprocal movement. So when my left leg steps forward, my right arm swings forward. So I'm creating tension across the back and a contraction across the front, across my body. So, and then the next step is right leg forward, right leg forward, left arm forward, which creates the opposite stretch and contraction. So I'm basically stretching, releasing, stretching, releasing. So you get this very energy efficient, stretch, relax, where I'm actually transferring energy side to side. So I don't have to produce as much energy as if there was no energy transfer, if that makes sense. And if you don't believe me, I would tell you, walk with your hands tied behind your back and then walk freely with your hands just swinging and tell me which one's easier. So that's like Fascia 101. And that's like muscle activation patterns 101.
So how in the world does all of that relate to pitching? Because I know there's going to be some people that are like, oh yeah, I understand how that works. And there's going to be some people that are, I need to rewatch this a couple of times. So how does all of this that I think generally people get from the explanation, how does that relate then to pitching or hitting or things like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So kind of like I had mentioned a little bit, there are some muscles that were just made to work together, and made to coordinate together. So your body is most efficient when you're creating tension in specific areas and when you're creating stretch in specific areas, and those should be opposite at a point in time. And so that's obviously in that kind of opposite stretch and contraction happens in reciprocal movement. So right arm paired with left leg, right arm paired with left leg, right leg paired with left arm. And then centered around this rotational component. So both batting and pitching are rotational. And so if you think about the rotational quality, there should be basically a closing. If I'm contracting, I should be closing the gap right arm, left leg, and lengthening the gap the opposite way from the backside, if that makes sense, and vice versa. So for example, hitting the kickback that we've seen all this like crazy stuff with. So if I keep my feet planted and swing, let's say a right-handed swing, so I'm bringing my right arm towards my left leg, but my left arm and my right leg are staying, there's no reciprocal change because my left leg's not moving. Well, if I kick my left leg back, now my left arm and left leg are actually moving in the direction they're supposed to with each other back. So small example of if you just change the motion a little bit to pair lower body with upper body in an opposite way, you're creating tension across your core in the way that it was designed, and you're creating coordination across the lower body and upper body the way it was designed. So anytime you have a full body movement, your upper and lower should be coordinated. And that's how we actually transfer energy. We talk about transferring energy from the ground up. That is through tension and creating tension in some of those muscle activation patterns. So unless I'm, for example, one of those big muscle coordination kind of pairings is opposite glute to lat. So when I swing a bat, my left lat is pulling back and my shoulder blade is retracting on that left side, but my right glute is supposed to be on with my lat. And so if I'm actually transferring energy from my back leg to my arms as I swing through, I should be contracting my glute, which is a hip extension move. So does that make sense? That answer your question? And I would say the same thing for pitching too. So you're obviously starting on one leg, you're rotated back towards that leg, one leg is up, and then you're going to swing down and come through, and then I'm bringing my right arm towards my left leg if I'm a right-handed pitcher. So you're rotating around a center point, and you're ultimately closing the gap between opposite lower and upper body extremities.
Makes sense. So I think it will help with visual. So I'm going to, since we talked about Altuve, I'm going to bring up a couple of videos of him. You let me know which one would work better to explain this.
When he watches, because for sure he's going to watch this. I hope he's not offended that I called him a little guy. For sure this is going back to him.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's probably watching it live right now.
As he should be.
All right. So, okay. In this video, we can see him from this angle. And then there's another one. We can see him here. Just what one would you prefer?
Let's go to the first one first.
Okay.
Okay, so just play it through, and then I would just say just watch his back leg. So it translates, if I'm just watching this straight on my screen, his back leg is translating further behind him. Contact through. Follow through. Okay, and then
let's go back here.
Yeah. So pause right there. They're a little bit further back.
At the end?
Pause him like, yeah, right after contact. Which I know is kind of an ordeal to get through on YouTube, but you're doing great. I mean, even that works right there. So if you look at this rotational moment, okay, so for example, one of the major slings in rotation is your anterior oblique sling. So this would look like right pec across rectus abdominis, left oblique, and then his hip adductor, so his groin muscles. So if you look basically, from a more simple standpoint, his right shoulder is getting closer to his left hip. So that chain right there is shortening. So right now, in order to shorten that chain, he's concentrically working his pec, his abdominals, and his groin that are all contracting and coming together here, which means on the backside, the opposite diagonal sling should be lengthening, which looks like basically right hip up through, So that's everything is concentrically contracting, coming together. On the opposite backside, you've got everything lengthening. If you're gonna make a cross on his like left shoulder to.
So this would be in the back though. So let's go yellow. So the yellow will be behind.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So you've got lengthening from the front. You've got his opposite side abdominals, right? So that right side abdominal is shortening, right side adductor is shortening. From the front, you have his groin's going to be lengthening, his hip flexor is going to be lengthening, and if he's rotating away, that pec is going to be lengthening on the left side, especially as he comes to follow through. So on the front, you have opposite X and X. One is lengthening, one is shortening. On the back, you'll have opposite X and X. One is lengthening, one is shortening. So like I said, that lat is pulling back, so he's getting shortened on the left lat, but then the right glute should be shortening as well. So that's your shortened chain on the back, and then obviously if you go opposite shoulder, it should be lengthening on the front. So left glute to right shoulder from the back is lengthened, but left front hip to right shoulder from the front is shortened. Does that make sense? So basically your red line is short in the front, long in the back. Your yellow line is long in the front, short in the back. But so pause them right there even. Unless that right hip kicks back, you're missing some of the shortening on that left line in the back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the visual helps, I think, a little bit more. Is there anything else in this one that you want me to show?
No, let's go to the other video. See if there's something there that I can.
Okay.
Explain.
I'm just learning how to. Undo.
I didn't even know you could draw on YouTube videos. It's fabulous.
Well, it's just through the Zoom app. Right. Let's go here. That. All right. Where do you want to go?
Just play it through once. Let me see. Pause them near contact again. Yeah, a little further back.
Further back?
Mm-hmm. A little further back. Okay, so as he's unweighting his back leg, you'll see it move posterior. It's not crazy dramatic. It's just a little bit. But basically, as he accepts weight onto his front leg, that back leg is unweighting, but also moving posterior. So let it play through from here. So he's basically closing the gap on this backside between right glute, left shoulder. And as he way follows through, obviously that's easier to see from this angle that the left shoulder is actually translating backward into scapular retraction, shoulder. Yeah, exactly. So that's the back line that's shortening. And then right shoulder to left glute is the back line that's lengthening. Part of how we transfer energy up through the core and how we create stability from the core is you basically have these two X's on the front and these two X's on the back, and one is lengthening, one is shortening. And so if you just take this diagonal line on the front, it's lengthening, on the back, it's shortening across that same direction. And so that's how you create stability around your spine. If you were lengthening in the same direction, front to back, you'd have no stability. Same thing if you were shortening on the same line, both directions. So creating kind of that cross tension front to back is what allows people to activate their core and transfer energy bottom up or top down, depending on what the movement is. So we talk a lot about bracing and creating force and power. Well, some of that force and power, this is a great example how the data doesn't tell us everything. We could never do a motion capture and tell you how well somebody's bracing. Like, that's not a data point that we can measure, but we could look at movement quality and see if people are actually moving reciprocally and be able to tell you, like, that is a position where somebody could brace well, and that's a position where somebody could create tension. That's a position where somebody could be powerful. So there are some intangibles like that I think coaches can tap into without having a number to be able to say, that is good, or you're at least in a position for success.
All right, let me see. I actually had to restart our Instagram live because I forgot after an hour it ends up kicking us off. So, all right, let me see if there's anything else super important that I want to cover, and then we'll move on to our famous to 15 people twins critique. Let's see. I think I might ask you some questions after. I'll have you stick on for a couple minutes or so. But let's move on to the twins critique. So I've already prepped you for this. You should have a world-class answer, like the best answer ever. So the twins critique, So the twins critique gives me a chance to kind of let everyone watching know a little bit more about what we do for our organization. So we have a travel baseball organization with the Indiana Twins. It's ages 8U through 17U, with our college guys coming back and training at some point throughout the year. They come in and out. And for the critique, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the two most important things, and then I want to get Emily's expert opinion on things that we can improve on, because we're always trying to evolve and get expert opinions and feedback on what we're doing so we can make it better. So the first thing that's important to us is, number one, that we all speak the same language. We started our in-house coaches certification this year, so all the coaches, the instructors were all tested and quizzed, and they had to pass all their tests in their respective areas to be able to be competent in that area based on what we all teach as an organization. So kind of streamline communication throughout the organization. And then the second important thing that we pride ourselves on is kind of being a one-stop shop. So we have a 20-week off-season program that includes hitting, pitching, mental training, and performance training for 20 weeks. And mental training sometimes goes longer than that. We also offer camps for infield, outfield, catching, base running. So basically, you get the idea that we incorporate basically anything that is under the baseball umbrella, and it's included in your fees. It's in that 20 weeks. And like I told Emily and everybody else, it's not a great way to make a ton of money, but our emphasis is on player development and developing the entire athlete. So we try to offer all those things. So within that, I want to hear and you might steer me in a different direction, but I want to hear your opinion or your feedback or your advice from a movement standpoint or an assessment standpoint or a training standpoint on things that you could see us do a better job of. And you can ask follow-up questions if you want to kind of figure out what that is, or areas that you see that for most organizations, teams, programs that don't get worked on or addressed very well, or maybe where things go wrong. So with all that said, what advice do you have?
So I guess my first follow-up question would be, assessment-wise, what kind of is your guys' process? What do you guys look like? What is your assessment?
So that's a really good question, and it has evolved every year. Like I said, I learned the FMS probably 7 to 10 years ago, so that was the first one, and then it's evolved. I've added and I tweaked. We've done the on-base use assessment. We did that a lot more last year. We also do a video assessment where we, like you had said, we record it, and based on combined 30, 40 years between a few of us, we're able to assess guys from just a movement standpoint, a mechanic standpoint. So we have kind of on file how they pitch, how they hit, and then I'm sure you're familiar with the on-base U assessment, or generally speaking, kind of the FMS and those kinds of things. So we try to have that on file or run a number of them through something like that, where it's more of a basic movement assessment or range of motion assessment without getting a goniometer or anything like that out.
Yeah.
And I'll add, the biggest struggle for us has been to find out what's most efficient, because there's so many different rabbit holes you can dive in on when you're doing all those assessments to find out what's the best bang for our buck.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's a pretty holistic response, especially for somebody that, doesn't have like a full lab or something like that to assess movement. So I think if you're doing something functional where kids are A, weight bearing, and B, actually actively moving through your assessment, I think that's going to be your best bet outside of movement. And the fact that you guys are looking at movement, I think you're spot on the right path. And you may have mentioned this, but my question was, do you have like some sort of strength and conditioning or programming in that regard with your kids as well?
Yes. So it's, and we brought this up in our last episode, it's actually one of our, I wouldn't say biggest struggles, but it's an area of hyper focus. We have performance training, which is basically like strength and conditioning. It's training. And it's every week up to 2 or 3 times a week. And it is technically optional. I mean, you're kind of given all this. So we find that more of our players want to come to the hitting or the pitching component and not as much the performance training. But that's starting to evolve and change. But yes, there is a program that is tiered pretty much to age. It's got a lot of different components about it. So what else do you want to know about that to help you?
I mean, just general programming wise, is it weight room wise, is it, pretty like standard, squats, presses, pulls, things like that? Or I don't know how much detail you want to dive into about kind of what that programming looks like or how you prescribe a strength training program?
So there's going to be multiple components. There's kind of a basic movement. So whether it's body weight, like let's say push-ups or squats, kind of there's a progression where we're working with body weight, we're working with kettlebells. The older high school guys, which typically have their own training program at their schools, can come in and they might do some higher loaded things, but kind of our core area is more in the youth with kind of fundamental movement with kettlebell, with lighter weights, with dumbbell, speed work, pushing the sled, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that's all great stuff. Maybe the only thing I would critique, as you say, or I would just say add on is, I mean, we just, kind of went into a tangent on reciprocal movement and some of these motor patterning things. And I'm a big fan of training reciprocal movement in the weight room. And that doesn't necessarily look like training actual throwing mechanics or training actual hitting mechanics. But if you are putting guys under load in a reciprocal pattern, I mean, it could be as simple as like push pull. So I'm not doing like a bench press where both arms are pushing together, because that's in movement wise and in rotational sports, both my pecs are never pushing together. It's a push pull that I'm doing, in whatever regard. So creating movements and basically a training schedule that allows some of that reciprocal movement, a lot of single leg stuff, a lot of rotational stuff. And again, that doesn't mean, a batter just swings a heavy bat to be a rotational movement. But like I said, it could be as simple as a push pull with upper body to create something that's reciprocal. But that fascia is responsive to load and tension. So the more we train reciprocally, the more tension we create across those reciprocal lines. And then the easier it is for guys to move rotationally well, because we've created tension in the areas that are supposed to be tensioned, and kind of basically we've created this rubber band slingshot effect because of the way we've trained guys. So obviously, like a squat is a foundational movement for a reason. And I would never say don't have guys squat, but I would say like make sure you are pairing that with alternating single leg stuff and like rotational single leg stuff, so that you are still getting some of those reciprocal movement patterns, because you will see that translate, even though you're not being specific in the exact movement program. You are being specific in the motor coordination and activation pattern that you want. And the other thing I would say is, especially with your young guys, it sounds like you offer like a lot of position specific stuff with some of the off-season program, which is awesome. The young guys, and maybe this is more so a word to parents, but I would stick your kid in every position specific camp, because the kids who are most well-rounded are going to be the best specialists. And it's very counter thinking. Like we think, if I want my kid to be a pitcher, he better start pitching when he's 8 and he's going to pitch all the way through college. Well, 1, you're putting a heck of a lot of tread on the tire. But 2, the some of the best pitchers are the most athletic, most reactive, most natural movers, and you become a natural mover by being well-rounded. And obviously, as a kid develops, like you can start to specialize, but especially those young guys, like the 8U and all those guys, like they should be playing in the infield, they should be playing in the outfield, they should be sprinting, they should be pitching, like they should be hitting, they should be doing all of these rotational movements so that they have, especially at that level when they're developing, they have that adaptability to create motor programs around these different demands. And then I think the final thing I would say is reactivity training. And you mentioned these kind of different ways that you train, and I would hit hard on the reactivity. So a lot of times what we do with players, especially the younger ones, is we coach them out of very natural movement patterns. I know this is something that Eugene harps on a lot too. And so a lot of times we get kids to move in a way that we think is correct, but isn't the way their body is naturally made to move. But if I have a kid just react to something, he's going to move naturally. He's going to move in a way that's most efficient because our cognitive process isn't taking over, our physical process is. So the more we can train kind of reactive moves as well, I think really sets kids up to throw really naturally. So, I mean, some of the most efficient, beautiful throwers are guys in the infield.
So give me some examples of reactionary training.
So we do stuff where it's like, a kid's laying on the ground, drop a tennis ball, they're going to see it drop. They're trying to catch it before it bounces, turn and throw. Or a pitcher having to turn, run, and throw, or jump and throw. Things where sometimes we have them respond to a light. Okay, when you see this light blink on, you're turning and throwing. When you see this ball bounce, you got to catch it before it goes, hit this target. So a lot of it's based on speed and either a visual or auditory cue. So it's usually based on an external cue. Get this ball here when you see this. So you're giving them no input about how to do it. They're just reacting to a time or a signal, if that makes sense.
So I'm going to ask another follow-up question, get real nitty-gritty on programming. So okay. On average, I would say at most we're going to have an athlete in for their performance training 2 times a week, but it's safe to say 1 time a week. So 1 time a week for 20 weeks, we got to cover a lot of areas in an hour. How much of that programming, whether weekly or throughout, should be reactionary, or would you program in reactionary?
So at this hour, I got to get in strength and conditioning, technique training, and reactionary, and potentially like position field work. That'd be fair to say.
What do you mean technique training? Like throwing, like pitching?
Yeah, if I was doing like drills with somebody or something like that.
No, so there's an hour of hitting, okay, which will then incorporate some drills or some med ball stuff. Same thing on the pitching side. They're going to throw, they're going to work on the drills, all that. The performance training is
more so just the strength and conditioning.
Yep.
Okay. Strength and conditioning, reactionary stuff, 10 minutes.
Every week, 20 weeks?
I don't think the volume has to be crazy. I just think I think it's almost like a primer.
I'm writing this down. All right. Since you already plugged it, I will let you plug away. I've given the opportunity because the people that I invite on, it's people that I trust. It's people that, I admire from one extent to another for a bunch of different reasons. Like I had already said, you're a smart mind, someone that I respect and that I look up to learn from. So I'm giving you the platform because I trust you, and I think you've earned it. And it's just I'm not trying to make like money off of this something, but you and Eugene have put together some programs. And so go ahead and tell us where we can follow you, where other people can follow you online, what you're doing, and then some of the programs you guys are offering.
Yeah. So thank you for that, by the way. That was super flattering. I am, like I said, I'm on Twitter. So I do try and post. It's almost exclusively for baseball. So I try and post as much as I can, just content that is relevant, that people could use, that hopefully get good information out there. So you can give me a follow. I try and be as responsive as possible. And if people have questions, like I said, this is really how I've learned this sport, is by teaming with people who have awesome questions. So if people do have questions, they can directly contact me there. And hopefully I can either test it for people or give my insight there. So hopefully Twitter is a good follow, but be potentially helpful for people as well. Movement First has an Instagram. Movement First with a one as the I in first is on Instagram. That's a little bit more of kind of all sports, what we do more holistically with us. And then, yeah, like you mentioned, 108 has put out some foundations of hitting and throwing courses. And so, and I've helped them develop a little bit of their assessment process, but also their movement analysis process and how to actually evaluate your players hitting or pitch delivery. So, and it's almost exclusively based on movement. There's some functional assessments, but it's really geared towards how do I start to look at movement? So you kind of asked me that question earlier. So for a coach who wants to start looking at movement and understanding efficient movement, I think it's a really great first step in to just foundationally look at, all right, if I have a video of a pitcher, where do I start? How do I start? And then this summer, we're actually coming out with, I've put together basically a foundations of biomechanics course. So again, you mentioned, which I think is awesome with your organization, let's get everybody speaking the same language. We're coming out with a course for basically for these coaches to understand, the physics terms that are involved in a biomechanical eval, the data that comes out of a biomechanical eval, what to look for, how to look at it, basically what a biomechanics evaluation is assessing and why. So basically just a very foundational level of how do I begin to speak the language of biomechanics? And then we'll kind of come out with courses to follow that up of, all right, you now understand biomechanics from a 101 standpoint. Let's get into the nitty gritty about what's happening with the arm and the physics behind what's happening with the arm and the forces and the numbers that are good, bad, and ugly, and the torso and the pelvis. And so it'll get deeper and deeper as we go. So people that want to take the deep dive, they can into the data, or people that just want to generally be able to speak that language and know what people are talking about, that's available as well. So that's all on 108's website. I think they're great. Obviously, because I've had my little role in them, but I obviously am a really big believer in what Eugene and the 108 guys do as well. So I would highly recommend.
Yep, we highly recommend it as well. We've bought the programs. We've got Eugene's book, so we had him on. We support him. He's a great guy too. And everyone at 108 is doing great things, yourself included. What was your Twitter handle?
At Ferree PT.
Okay, that's 2 R's, 2 E's, right?
Yes, FERREEPT.
All right. Well, Emily, I'll have you stay on for a couple minutes afterward, but I appreciate it, and we will look forward to seeing everyone soon.
Yeah, thank you so much.